Red. Red, wake up. He heard someone blue bang loudly on his door. His eyes jolted awake. He was on his feet instantly with Pikachu by his side, hand brushing for his belt which he left on a chair to his right. He grabbed it, clicking it on and walking to the door, ignoring his jacket and instead opening the door clad in his usual midnight black shirt and dark blue pants. He opened the door, arching an eyebrow at Blue, who looked incredibly energetic for the morning. Red. The tournament's starting today. Ash's friends already came by and they're out shopping or something. I was hoping that maybe we could go scope out the competition before going to that mandatory meeting and finding out our battle schedules. Blue asked hopefully and Red stared. He shrugged, opening the door a little wider and allowing the brown-haired boy into his room. Blue gave a small scratch to Pikachu before releasing his own Jolteon, who purred and shot off a few friendly sparks at Pikachu, who responded. Red grabbed his coat, slipping it on his thin frame while he turned, sliding his hat on and noticing how Blue's eyes were locked at his waist looking at the Master Ball. Red pointedly shifted the belt, hiding it from sight. He turned, looking at Blue pointedly while the trainer blinked, smiling and walking out the door while Red followed, clipping his keys awkwardly to his hip as he followed after Pikachu, jumping and landing on his shoulder with amazing leg strength. They moved, the two looking at ease as various smaller Pokemon and trainers ran through the crowd, Blue laughing as two smaller kids ran up and asked if they could pet his Jolteon, who seemed pleased at the attention. They managed to walk all the way across to a small area where trainers were competing. It wasn't a battle that Red had ever seen, and he was drawn to the less powerful moves, but instead the surprising mesmerizing beauty of them. Hey, that must be a contest battle. Dawn was telling me about them. Blue nudged, watching as an electrode used its electricity to create small marks and a mini explosions. Hey Blue. Red. They turned, seeing a waving Ash who was not only followed by Brock, but also by Dawn and an unfamiliar tall blonde-haired woman. Hey guys, we just got out not that long ago. Blue smiled and Ash grinned. Nice to see you two again. Dawn smiled, waving to Red, who gave a slight nod back. So you're Red and Blue. I've heard a lot about you from Ash, Brock and Dawn. The new blonde smiled, looking at Red, she being the same height as he. He looked at her, his eye color not surprising her but amusing both of them slightly, as both of their eye colors matched their outfits. My name is Cynthia, it's a pleasure to meet you both. She smiled, offering a hand while Red's eyes widened slightly as he shook her hand, her eyes meeting her own before he offered a small smirk, a challenging smirk. The slight predatory look in his eye as his pupils narrowed, she tightened her grip as her own look turned predatory. A battle? He asked silently, and instead of her actually answering verbally, she gave a slight incline of her head before letting go, shaking Blue's hand with a polite smile. So what are you going to be doing today? Blue asked Cynthia, interested, while she gave a slight chuckle, her hands sliding into her long black coat pockets while she looked at Red with a small smile. Well, it seems that I'm going to have a battle with Red, if that's okay with you. She politely asked Ash, whose eyes bugged out. What? Dawn asked in surprise while Red gave a slight smirk, his Pikachu sparking quickly while Ash's Pikachu just shook its head in disbelief. That's nice and all, but don't we have to go to the main hall to get our schedules? Ash asked with a frown, causing Red to mirror it with a scowl while Cynthia apologized with a small smile. I apologize, Red, perhaps we will battle in the finale. Cynthia smiled before turning, beginning to wave. Wait. Blue spoke, turning and chasing a few steps after Cynthia, who turned curiously. Do you know anything about a group called Team Rocket? Red flashed his arm out, grabbing Blue's shoulder with surprising speed and causing the other to jump slightly, before giving Red a completely calm and serious face. Red, she's the champion. She can help. Red's eyes narrowed as he looked at Blue intently, as if saying, are you saying that I can't? The champion battle. Blue reminded before breaking free from Red's grip and turning to Cynthia, who had a slight scowl on her face as she remembered Team Rocket. I've met 3 Team Rocket agents there, foes of Ash, right? She asked with a scowl while Blue gave a nod, shooting a look to Ash, who shrugged. Right. We have intel that says that they're going to try and attack the champion battle, you versus the winner. I think they want to take out the best trainers in the world so they have nobody to challenge them. We wanted to let you know so you're prepared for when they strike. Blue nodded and Cynthia looked at him carefully, judging him for all doubt. I've met Team Galactic. Have you heard of them? Red's eyes widened as his mind flashed to the legendary voice that spoke those names. For that, I must insist on your help. There are others who threaten the balance. Those of Aqua and those of Magma. Those of space itself, those of Galactic. He would never forget them. Red moved forward, looking at Cynthia before giving a sharp nod. What? You know of them? Cynthia asked and Blue snapped his head around in surprise. What? No, how in Arceus do you know of them? I don't know of Team Galactic. There's no way you would have heard about them from some puny trainer up on your little mountain. Blue argued and Cynthia arched an eyebrow while Red ignored Blue, looking at Cynthia calmly. I'll keep my guard up during my battle. Thank for the warning. Cynthia smiled, turning with a wave as she walked away, her long blonde hair trailing behind as the group turned walking towards the stadium where the first times would be displayed. When they arrived, already the massive crowd was thinning, displaying times and the line-ups with faces that were required for the form. Hey! Look! Paul is here! Ash shouted, pointing to one of the faces, the boy that Red had met before. Sure enough, a frowning serious face was all that identified Paul, but ironically, it was fitting. So is Barry. Brock pointed to another face, a boy with blonde hair and orange eyes with a cocky grin. Huh, so you know these peep? Blue spoke, freezing as he stared at a single face, Red losing interest and wandering along the board, looking for himself. What's wrong, Blue? Dawn asked curiously and Blue swallowed, pointing to an eerily familiar face. This one, who is he? He pointed to a kid, older than Ash but with a golden hat and a grin, black hair peeking out from under the backwards rim. Huh. Oh. I know him, his name is Jimmy. Ash smiled, looking at the paper with a shrug. We battled once, a really long time ago. He had a tie. Typhlosion. Blue asked with a dry swallow, causing Ash to look at him in surprise. Yeah, how did you know? He asked in surprise, and Blue shook his head with a scowl before responding. Just tell me when you see this, Jimmy. He's familiar with Red and me, not on good terms with Red. I think you should try to keep him away from Red unless it's imposable. Blue warned, walking away once he memorized his first opponent, time, and stadium. He had to tell Red fast. Gold's counterpart was here. XXX. Red knew that Blue was searching for him, although he was rather fascinated with Ash's apparent rival, Paul. The trainer was different, something cold and calculating. A person who once could have been as careless and as carefree as a child before turning still and barely responsive to those other than Pokemon. Paul reminded Red of himself. That was why he had found Paul's first battle time, walking into the open stadium where only a few other trainers were, scoping out their possible future opponent. He watched calmly as the purple-haired trainer sent out the Electivire Red had spotted before, managing to take down the foe's Poliwrath with little difficulty, soon vanquishing their opponent's every Pokemon while swapping out an Ursaring, Torterra. The battle finished rather quickly, the other trainers leaving once they saw the opposing boy had no hope of winning. Soon, all that was left once the boy ran out nearly crying was the cool confident Paul who turned to walk out of the arena, eyes catching Red as he managed to look slightly surprised. You again. Paul muttered moving towards the exit all the while keeping eye contact with Red, only breaking as Red descended the steps walking forward while he heard Paul hurry after him. You. Paul stated, rushing after Red while Red turned his head partway, crimson eyes looking eerie as Paul caught up, walking quietly next to Red. I looked you up in the database, you appeared out of nowhere. Paul commented casually, causing Red to look out at him slightly, not making a word. The Pokemon you use are rather odd, all three starters of Kanto if I'm correct. A Snorlax, normally a useless sleeping creature, an Espeon and a Pikachu. I wondered why you didn't evolve your Pikachu, but I've underestimated a Pikachu before. Paul spoke, sliding his eyes to Red who said nothing, his hat brim low on his face. I'm curious as to why you're following me and watching me, but I assume it's because you think we'll battle at some point. Paul casually stated, causing Red to give a slight smile, his Pikachu giving a Pika and a slight nod. I managed to watch your schedule. If I'm correct, you're battling in less than half an hour in the West Wing. And if I'm right, we're going there now. Red gave a slight nod, and the two continued on in silence, Red slightly happy that he had found another who cared little for talking. It was actually rather nice. They walked into the stadium, Paul giving Red one last lingering look before the former walked up into the stands, crossing his arms and watching quietly as Red walked out onto his side of the field. A new trainer running out, panting slightly as he skidded to a stop with a wince and an awkward wave. Are the red and green corners ready to battle? The referee asked, looking between the two. Once he received a nod, the ref lifted both flags. This will be a one-on-one Pokemon battle. The battle will continue until all three Pokemon are unable to battle. Begin. The ref nodded. Go. Glameow. The boy shouted, a cat-like Pokemon landing with a slight hiss towards Red. Red barely passed it a look as he nodded to his Pikachu, who jumped onto the ground with sparking cheeks, ready for battle. Slash. The boy shouted and the Glameow snarled, running forward with its long tail trailing behind. Pikachu looked at Red, who gave a small smirk before very pointedly shaking its head in a no. Paul frowned, not sure what the shake was for, but instead of actually saying a command, the Pikachu looked back at the field calmly. The Glameow charged, slashing out with long claws, and instead of waiting for a command, Pikachu spun, using Iron Tail automatically to deflect the blow and slam the creature across the field across the ground. What? Glameow. Feint attack. The boy shouted again and the Glameow vanished from sight. Pikachu ducked its head, lowering it and pointing its ears while it didn't respond at all. It spun, sending out an electrical current with a sharp, pika pika. The bolt shooting and landing firmly on the mid-air Glameow, causing it to twitch and collapse to the ground. No. Glameow return. The boy cried, panicking slightly before pausing and throwing another Pokeball. Go. Sandslash. Slash. Slash. Sandslash shouted, clipping its nails together while growling at Pikachu. A type disadvantage. Electric attacks won't affect Sandslash. Paul muttered, wondering which Pokemon Red was going to use next. Instead of returning, Pikachu stood its ground, waiting patiently while the Sandslash growled at the Pikachu. Sandslash. Dig. Sand. Sandslash roared, diving into the ground while the Pikachu looked into the ground with slight alarm. It looked at Red with obedience as it paused, Red pointing up, and the Pikachu sprung into the air just as the Sandslash broke the dirt, surprised by the lack of opponent. Pika. Pikachu roared, gaining power as it slammed painfully into the hard Pokemon, crumpling it into the ground as it winced, yelping and skidding away in pain, flinching slightly from the slam. Ah! Sandslash, use Euro Ball. The trainer shouted desperately and Pikachu landed softly, electricity crackling around it. What's he doing? Paul muttered from the stands, watching intently how Red didn't seem concerned in the lightest. Sandslash spun, claws outwards as it picked up speed, flying towards Pikachu with incredible force while instead of jumping out of the way, Pikachu's tail glowed as it jumped, sending it down onto the Pokemon with enough force it to penetrate the earth, knocking it out cold. No. Gah. Return. Go Archon. Red lifted an eyebrow at the brightly colored Pokemon, having to take his Pokédex out to scan the flying chunk of rock, lifting an eyebrow at the display while giving a smile and a nod to his Pikachu. Archon. Use Rock Slide. It roared, flapping in the air as rocks appeared around Pikachu, who simply sat upright, allowing the rocks to fall closer. Get out of the way. Paul muttered, watching the battle with fascination as the Pikachu didn't even try to avoid the attacks. It sprang, kicking off of the rocks to jump higher into the air as it released a huge wave of electricity, the power spiraling towards the flying rock type. It made contact and the bird screeched, wincing as the normally not effective attack hit and grew. The Pikachu landed, finding no issue with continuing the strain of the electricity for a good 10 seconds before letting go once Red snapped, the bird Pokemon falling over in a good feint. The winner is the red corner. The ref called, slightly amazed by Red himself as the trainer turned, Pikachu jumping onto his shoulder as he walked out, Paul quickly moving by his side. That was very impressive. Paul spoke, and Red smiled slightly. He could tell that Paul wasn't one to give compliments to everyone. Red gave a slight incline of his head to agree with his statement while his Pikachu gave a slightly more direct approach of stating rather happily, "Cha." Red managed a flicker of a smile on his lips while Paul let out a low breath, closing his eyes and stopping, causing Red to pause and look back at him with a question in his eyes. "You managed to take out 3 Pokemon with a single one of yours. 2 of the 3 were a type disadvantage and yet, you beat them with less than 3 moves." Red said nothing, his Pikachu looking at Paul questioningly while Paul suddenly summoned his courage and opened his eyes. "I don't believe in miracles, but your arrival is incredible. I've never heard of you, nobody has, and you show up and turn out to be incredible. You're impossible," Paul stated, and just as Red shook his head, starting to walk, Paul said what he wanted. "I want you to teach me." Red paused, turning and looking at Paul with a lifted eyebrow while Paul looked at Red with a confident look, as if challenging the elder to say no. Pikachu Pai Pikachu Chu. Red's Pikachu jumped over, landing on Paul's shoulder, taking the younger male by surprise as the little creature stared at him intently before firing off something at Red quickly. Red paused, looking at Paul with crimson eyes shadowed from his hat before he grabbed the top of his hat and taking it off, shaking his head slightly to get his hair to shift from his eyes, showing uncanny resemblance to a certain rival of Paul. "No way." Paul spoke, taking a step back before staring at Red in some form of shock and awe as the older man slipped the hat back on, revealing only crimson eyes from the shadows of his hat. "Are you related to Ash? A brother? A cousin?" Paul asked, shaking his head as if it would shake the idea out of his head, and Red showed teeth in his smirk, holding his arm for Pikachu to jump upon, walking a few steps before looking at Paul as if waiting for the older male to follow. Paul spoke, pausing as he shook his head, still majorly confused on what was happening. Red flashed a Pokeball, summoning a large fit orange dragon which stretched with a yawn, firing a burning plume of fire into the air as a stretch, looking lazily at Red before it straightened up once seeing Paul. At once it pulled its teeth back in a snarl, rising from its position on 4 legs to 2, standing high above Paul in a looming act of dominance. Ursarin, Paul starting, hand instinctively going towards the Pokeball. He paused when Red snapped his fingers, the Pokemon looking to him quickly before backing down and looking at Red curiously, who gently patted the dragon, rubbing his hand over the strong neck and upon the sharp points of its skull. The Charizard snorted black smoke and lowered itself, understanding immediately what Red wanted. It looked at Paul before snorting a small amount of black smoke, staring at Paul as he only swatted the smoke away, not backing down from the orange dragon. Pikachu Chu Pikachu Pai. Pikachu spoke, jumping onto the Charizard, and the beast only snorted and nodded, looking at Red and extending its wings once crouched. Red walked over, and without hesitation climbed onto the creature while looking at Paul expectantly. "Wait, you want me to ride that?" Paul asked in surprise while Red merely leaned back waiting patiently while Paul awkwardly shifted forward, not yet trusting the beast. Pai Pikachu Chu. Pikachu smiled, waving at Paul as he awkwardly climbed onto the beast, sitting a little too stiffly for actually flight, so Red gave a slight chuckle, using one arm to link it around the kid's waist, pulling him into a more comfortable position while Paul jumped at the sudden touch. Paul looked at him slightly puzzled before Red nodded to Pikachu, who was sitting between the 2 short horns on Charizard's head, gripping the 2 spikes firmly as it looked at Paul with a cheeky grin and a "Cha." What are you?" Paul quickly silenced himself as Red gently pressed on Charizard's chest with his heels, causing the beast to spring into the air with 2 mighty flaps. Red actually laughed, a voice light and airy enough to be lost in the air. It was a new sound for Paul, who hadn't actually heard Red speak at all during the time that the elder had been watching him and vice versa. "Was Charizard your first Pokemon?" Paul asked casually, looking at the large beast while looking at the clouds they now flew above. Pikachu spoke, using its tail to point to itself while Paul looked slightly surprised, now having figured that Red didn't speak ever. "So do you actually live in Kanto like your form said?" Paul asked again, quirking one eyebrow while Red gave a slight smile, shaking his head. "Where are you from then?" Paul asked, and with another nudge and an unexpected roll he was wrapping both arms harshly around Charizard's neck as his coat fluttered in the wind. Red chuckled once again, his Charizard spinning upwards and breaking through the clouds before flaring its wings, halting their flight until Paul looked up, the sight of the looming MT. Silver was high above them still as it casted a shadow upon the clouds below. You're from MT. Silver. Do you have a house on the ridge? Paul asked out of curiosity while his Pikachu shook its head. Pika. Pika Pikachu Chu Pai Pikachu. Paul stared at it blankly while Red moved his arm, the red sleeve catching Paul's attention as he saw Red point to the peak of the mountain, causing Paul's eyes to widen. The peak. You lived at the summit. That's the harshest environment in the world MT. Cornet's the only thing that compares. Paul argued and Red said nothing, shifting on the dragon until he was in a more secure post. Paul shifted himself, noting how Red position changed his position and tried to mimic it the best he could, having never flown on a Pokemon before. Red gave a slight smirk, grabbing his hat and pushing it harder on his head before securely grabbing onto the Charizard, Pikachu securely grabbing the two horns of Charizard while wrapping its tail around for another guard. Paul suddenly had an awful feeling about what was happening. Charizard roared, flapping twice and angling upwards before in a brief moment of the three being upside down it turned, pulling into a vertical near-falling motion. There was an odd sensation that Paul felt, almost a nauseous feeling before suddenly, an odd tingling throughout his chest and suddenly, he was holding onto the creature, but he wasn't sitting on it. He looked at the Pikachu in front of him, rather awestruck by the odd sight of the Pikachu floating in free air, only connected to the falling creature by its long yellow tail. He looked behind to Red who moved in the fall, holding onto the Charizard while pulling his legs up into a crouch, perched on the creature before he jumped, falling into free air and so much further than Paul was beside a falling Red, who was looking at Paul almost silently laughing as Paul looked at Red who was plummeting right beside them, smiling at his Pikachu who squealed with a "Cha. Enjoy it the fall." The Charizard roared once and Paul suddenly realized just how close they were to colliding with the ground. Red's smile fell as instantly he moved, snaking out with a arm and snagging the neck just behind Paul and pulling himself towards the dragon, locking his ankles just as the creature pulled up, skimming across the tops of the stadiums, allowing the three a brief moment to spot Pokemon battling below. The force of the fall caused Paul to wince as he tried to hold his neck up, watching as the dragon turned with an easy tilt of his wings, zooming over with slowing speed over the major roads, high enough for anyone to not see who rode the terrifying beasts, but low enough for the group to see anyone who walked below. Red could spot Blue smiling as he have a swift pat to Ash's back, ginning wildly while Ash gave a silent laugh and shooting one arm into the air in victory. Red looked away with a small exhale of breath and closed his eyes, Paul noticed, but wisely didn't say anything, actually enjoying the flight. Amazing, my rival and my counterpart cooperate better than me and my alternate self. It's uncanny, how I and my counterpart's rival get along better. Red thought with an internal laugh of dry amusement. Charizard touched down, claws digging in while the three jumped slightly at the jolt of impact, Charizard dropping onto four legs as it took a few steps before lowering itself to the ground. It shifted its wings to allow an easier dismount, Paul taking a few wobbly steps while Pikachu jumped to the ground, racing around Charizard in obvious glee. Red stepped down, looking at Paul as Paul gave one smile to Red, giving a slight nod while Red returned the smile. He lived on MT. Silver all alone. Nobody has heard of him, his hometown is small and he doesn't speak. He doesn't have friends, he's like me, only his Pokemon. Paul held a hand out, finally feeling enough respect to find this loner an equal and worthy foe. I don't know anything about you, nor do I know that much about the Pokemon of Kanto, but I can tell that you're unique. Paul smiled, looking at the Pikachu who was tugging gently on his pant leg. Pika Pi. Pikachu Chew. Pikachu smiled with a small squeal as Paul hesitantly reached down to rub the head of the Pikachu. Charizard snorted slightly, rising onto its hind legs while it looked at Paul calmly, extending one of its claws in which Paul shook, giving a nod of respect. The Pokemon returned with a low grumble. I am from an alternate universe. Paul spun, hearing the unexpected voice, something cool and indifferent with nearly no sign of emotion. It was something eerily, something slightly haunted that he wished he could hear again and yet, wished he didn't. What? Paul spoke, turning in surprise while his mind flooded with his encounter with Cynthia, the Pokemon who controlled time and bent dimensions. I Palkia. Dialga? Paul asked, looking at Red with some newfound light. His looks, his Pikachu of Arceus, he's Ash. Close. Arceus found me important, and I agreed. There are organizations which are destroying the balance I created. Team Aqua, Magma, Rocket and Galactic. Paul stared. He just stared. This trainer was granted the ability to travel dimensions by Arceus. Why are you telling me this? Paul asked, looking frustrated if anything while Red looked calmly at the shorter and younger boy. He silently recalled his Charizard and Pikachu jumped up upon his shoulder. Because you're useful. Red stated, looking at Paul while Paul's eyes widened and he stumbled back in surprise, looking at Red who said nothing. Who are you? Paul whispered, and Red gave a small smirk. He turned, walking towards where the larger buildings and where the stadiums were. Paul looked quickly at his watch, feeling amazed that already it was nearly time for his and Red's second battle. My room is 35. Paul spoke, and Red gave a slight nod, leaving Paul standing awkwardly in the forest by the road before sighing, he also walking towards his own stadium, thoughts muddled by Red. XXX. Hey Red. How were your battles? Ash called, causing Red to stop his walking towards the result panel. He was particularly curious at this point who he would be against, now that the challengers had been reduced a significant amount. Red gave a slight nod, this time having Espeon by his side, having used it for the entire battle prior. Pikachu and I won, it wasn't as easy as the first one. Ash smiled, his Pikachu squealing happily while looking at Red who gave a small smile to the creature before looking at the board. Looks like Blue won his battles, so did Barry O. You don't know Barry, do you? Ash stated, looking at Red with large eyes while Red looked at the photo, not recognizing the kid. Well, he's a rival of mine from Sinnoh. Ash shrugged while Red rolled his eyes. How many rivals did Ash have? Oh, Paul got through his battles too. Ash pointed out, Red looking at the board out of curiosity over whom Paul would be battling next. It didn't seem like anybody complicated if that, some poor excuses of trainers would rival against Paul. Ash scowled at his position and his placement was dangerously close to the purple-haired man's. Paul and I are strained. My Infernape used to be his Chimchar. I've only won once against Paul. Ash sighed, and Red looked at Ash interestedly, only once. But Blue is showing me a few things. I think that with the new tips he's showing me I'll beat Paul like nobody else. Ash grinned, looking determined while his Pikachu shouted in agreement. Red stared at Ash before turning on his heels and walking away, offering a dismissive wave which Ash returned, apparently going to meet up with Misty and May somewhere. Red moved, looking at his Espeon which led the way to Blue, who was lounging by a fountain his Blastoise was enjoying as well as a dugong and a happily splashing Dragonair. Red. Blue stated, his Blastoise looking up in surprise before a nod towards Espeon and resumed its swim. Red gave Blue a look, walking forward quietly while Espeon padded silently next to him, flickering her split tails as she observed him with slit eyes. What's wrong? Blue asked with confusion while Espeon's eyes glowed, picking up Blastoise and sending him onto the ground roughly. Blast. Blastoise growled, aiming his cannons at Espeon who sent a protect in front of the two, while Red glared at Blue, crossing his arms. Do you want to train or something? Blue asked with confusion while the Dragonair watched interestedly. Red purposefully gave a sigh at that, looking at Blue pointedly while Blue blinked, thinking of previous actions. I was helping Ash, that's what this is about. Blue asked with confusion while Red snorted and shook his head, reaching in his pocket and pulling out a picture. What? This is Paul. Ash's rival, why do you have a picture? Blue frowned while Red pointed to the picture before jerking it at himself. Blue was confused before his jaw slackened and he shook his head. No, we are not going to set them against each other. Red, he's against Ash. Blue stressed and Red shook his head, pointing at Blue who wordlessly tried to exclaim. But I'm only helping him. Red pointed from the picture to himself and Blue threw his hands up in the air in frustration. So that's what you want. You want to still challenge each other and now we're making kids fight for us. Fine. Blue scowled, Recalling a startled Blastoise and stalking off, Red, blinking and with a small sigh and still upset temper, started walking towards his room. Time to find Paul. Paul was rather startled when he opened his door after 2 loud knocks. He lifted an eyebrow at Red, who was leaning calmly in the doorway, his Espeon by his side. Although Paul had heard and seen pictures of Espeons before, he had never actually seen one. He couldn't help but look at it curiously as it walked forward, slipping by him and snaking its twin tails around his hand as it walked past. He followed it as it walked in his room, watching it in confusion as it stood near the window, looking at him calmly while Paul very slowly stepped inside his room, letting Red in. "You're here again. Now as for why you're here." Paul paused when Red snagged a picture he printed from the online database, as well as Paul's picture, but he didn't need to know that. "Ash. I'm not friends with him." Paul scowled, and Red shook his head, pointing at Paul and then himself. "You want to teach me?" Paul asked somewhat hesitantly while Red gave a small nod. Paul just looked at Red carefully, looking at his face and his expression, searching for any hint of a lie. Finding none, Paul gave a small nod, shifting his purple coat to allow Red to briefly see all 6 Pokémon he had while taking his small handheld Pokédex device. Red noted this and he gave a slight nod, moving while Espeon obediently followed, brushing past Paul and just to tease him, letting her twin tails brush over his hand again. Espeon. She hummed, racing after Red calmly and throwing Paul a look which he smiled slightly at, following from a slight distance. They moved towards the forest, Paul still a slight distance behind as they moved towards a clearing that Paul had been practicing in before. Red nodded towards Paul, his hands moving to his Pokeballs and pulling them all out, hesitating before obliging and sending his comrades out. Torterra was the first to appear, stomping loudly then snorting at Espeon, who didn't even blink. Magmortar and Electivire appeared next, standing besides Torterra as Paul reached for the remaining 3. An Ursaring, a Weavile, and a Honchkrow stood, looking curiously at Red, who walked closer, examining a few Pokémon that he was faintly able to recognize from previous challengers before using his Pokédex to scan the rest, wisely not looking at the level area. "What about yours?" Paul challenged, and Red met Paul's eyes, pulling his coat open and pulling out 6 Pokeballs, hand not even brushing over the purple Master Ball. Paul's eyes widened momentarily as it saw the Master Ball, giving only to trainers who had accomplished great tasks, having the ability to catch any Pokémon without fail. Espeon. Espeon cried, standing strongly near the center as Pikachu appeared next to her, eyeing up Paul's team. Quick to join behind was an enormous Snorlax which looked more muscular than Paul imagined Snorlax could, however he could be mistaken. Behind the Espeon and Pikachu but in front of the Snorlax were all 3 of Kanto starters, the Charizard Paul fondly remembered flying on, as well as a Blastoise which was looking at Torterra with interest, while a Venusaur lazily eyed up Magmortar. "Impressive." Paul spoke, looking at each and every Pokémon while Red smiled slightly, looking at Paul's Weavile more closely, touching its arm and causing it to spring away with a guarded hiss. Red pulled upright, snapping an all of his Pokémon looking at him intently. With the original silence, Red quickly paired off Pokémon, causing Paul to look at him with a frown. He snapped and pointed to Electivire, his Pikachu bounding over before standing carefully in front of the larger Pokémon which seemed to remind Electivire of Ash's Pikachu. Espeon was quick to move next, settling next to Ursaring much to Paul's surprise. Blastoise claimed Magmortar and eyed down its opponent. Charizard snorted once before taking flight, Honchkrow quick to follow with its black wings. Venusaur claimed Torterra, scowling at its opponent while the 2 grass starters shifted weight. Snorlax lumbered over to the very intimidated Weavile before standing at the ready. "You want them to battle?" Paul asked, arching one eyebrow while Red gave one nod, causing Paul to sigh, looking at each of his Pokémon carefully before giving a nod. "Attack." Torterra. Use. Paul stopped while Red held his hand out, causing Paul to stop and Red wave his hand. Pika. Pikachu charged, moving quickly and started to attack, causing each of Red's Pokémon to move, each starting a new attack. "You want me to just let them stand there and take this?" Paul asked, looking at Red, who shook his head, pointing to Torterra, who scowled at Venusaur before firing Razor Leaf hesitantly, as if guessing. You want them to learn to attack on their own. Paul guessed and Red nodded, causing Paul to let out a breath before looking at his Pokémon carefully and taking a commanding voice. Attack, he stated firmly, and his Pokémon obeyed, charging forward with whichever attack they so desired. Paul watched somewhat in surprise as his Torterra was actually the only Pokémon who was attacking on several higher level moves. It was impressive, watching his Pokémon attack hopelessly against Red's Pokémon. It seemed that out of his Pokémon, the only ones who managed to be slightly okay were Electivire and Torterra. He watched slightly amused as his Pokémon tired themselves out. Reds were not feeling back in any way or form. Enough. My starter versus yours, Paul stated, causing Red to look at him blankly and smiled, shaking his head as Red's Pokémon backed away, all being recalled. Not today, Paul asked, slightly disappointed while Red gave a small smile. In the finals, Red spoke, and Paul gave a slight nod, waiting while Pikachu said something to Electivire, causing Electivire to look at Pikachu in surprise and respond back with hums. The two conversed before Pikachu ran back, jumping onto Red's shoulder as the two walked away. Paul looked at the two retreating while turning and looking at Electivire, who was speaking rapidly to his other Pokémon. They spoke amongst themselves with interest before looking at Paul with a slightly upset look on their face. Paul sighed, recalling them while remembering their opposing Pokémon constantly speaking. Maybe Red's Pokémon were actually helping. Paul gave a sigh, turning and slipping his Pokémon back onto his belt as he walked back into the city. He briefly looked at the chart, seeing that Ash had won his third battle, now narrowing down the competition to almost interesting levels. Red apparently hadn't battled his third one, as it was where he had run off to. His friend, Blue. Paul had done his research, had won not only his third, but his fourth battle as well, leading him into the semifinals. Barry was battling currently also, and as much as Paul liked battling possible good opponents, he was sick of that child. Really sick of him.